There is footage available, a camera hidden in a private room's darkness. A discussion that was never intended for listeners other than those in the room at that precise moment. A woman confronted what she thought was a wealthy businessman who was ready to assist her in resolving her most urgent problem. Furthermore, nothing she has said subsequently has been able to totally repair or explain away the alarmingly detailed, unquestionably destructive, and permanently recorded statements that result from their conversation. £500,000 with cash and a proposal to open doors to set up access to individuals and locations that her name could not reach on its own. A handshake in that private moment turned Sarah Ferguson's financial troubles from a personal family issue spoken in palace hallways into a disastrous public scandal that would always have a price tag and a specific timestamp. However, this story doesn't really start at that point in 2010. It was one very striking and graphically captured manifestation of a pattern that has been present in her life for decades prior to the filming, and that has persisted in its fundamental nature for years following the release of the video. You must first comprehend what preceded that sting operation in order to fully comprehend what it showed. This is a financial tale that began in the most unlikely of circumstances. A woman of modest resources would be placed in one of the most intricate and unusual institutional setups in the contemporary world through a royal wedding in Westminster Abbey, as an system that would ultimately result in the exact situation that exists in 2026 after more than 30 years of compounded decisions, and their effects, financial bailouts and dramatic relapses back into disaster. When Sarah Ferguson, then 26 years old, appeared in front of the world on a July afternoon in 1986 at Westminster Abbey, her relationship with money was very different from the one that regular people have to deal with. The royal family handles money differently than the rest of us. The expenses are enormous and quite unfathomable, but they are absorbed by systems designed specifically for this purpose rather than by the individuals themselves. The private estates, the sovereign grant, and the institutional machinery of household administration are all so opaque that even those in charge of them frequently find it difficult to explain who is responsible for what and how the payment mechanisms actually work. It is a very precise and extremely dangerous assumption about what this particular arrangement generates in someone who enters that society from outside without having been sculpted and formed by years within it. An assumption that solidifies with every year that goes by. The belief that the price tag is never a limiting factor, that the expense of everything you desire, no matter how ostentatious, no matter how impractical it may appear to others, will be handled by systems that exist completely outside of your own resources. Your own assessment. Throughout her tenure as a duchess, Sarah Ferguson's expenditures during her years in the royal marriage nearly perfectly mirrored that expectation. According to reports from that time period, annual spending was close to $900,000, spending tens of thousands of pounds just on flowers, going on shopping trips that might exhaust five-figure sums in the time it takes the average person to finish a week of supermarket shopping, and accumulating clothes at a rate that no income she would have ever been able to produce herself. Instead of any serious evaluation of what her own personal funds could truly sustain, staff was kept at numbers that mirrored the royal household model. All of this expenditure was predicated on the same constant premise. The phrase, "the cost is not my problem, the cost belongs to the system, and the system will absorb it," is repeated in both big and small decisions. The system actually did for a while. Elizabeth II Queen. She is said to have stepped in several times to help stabilize the financial situation, including making a sizable payment in the mid-1990s when creditors demanded that debts that had reached crisis proportions be settled right away. That involvement was important not only financially, but also in terms of the message it conveyed over time. When you run out of money, the problem you caused by your decisions will be fixed by someone else's money. It's the lesson that truly sticks in the recipient's mind, not the one that ought to be imparted. The lesson it imparts is that the system will catch you and that, regardless of how much you spend compared to your actual income, a resolution will come about because that is what has always happened in the past and can thus be anticipated to continue indefinitely. The official framework of the agreement altered with the divorce in 1996, but the expectations it had raised remained the same. She left the marriage with a settlement of about £900,000, which, by the standards of the world she had been living in, seemed modest on the surface. However, when you compare it to the annual expenditure of the years before it, you realize that it represented about a year of operation at the level of spending she had normalized as her baseline, the safety net provided by the institution that has been absorbing the expenses associated with that level of operation were now completely eliminated. However, the belief that expenses would be covered by a system she did not personally finance persisted. That ancient expectation was given fresh life and support by the American reinvention. Her royal adjacent name allowed her to establish a commercial presence in the United States in ways that the British public had been taught not to embrace. American viewers were significantly more receptive to celebrity commercial activity, such as book agreements, television appearances, and endorsement arrangements, than their British counterparts. TV shows, publishing endeavors, and Weight Watchers, the money was coming in. In the most tangible sense, the emergence of a steady second act was real money was regularly coming in. The money was entering a spending environment that had been tuned to a considerably higher level than what the commercial income could realistically sustain, which was the ongoing and unresolved problem. The void that had developed throughout the marriage remained. In a situation where the rescue mechanisms were significantly less automatic and dependable than they had been previously, the debt that had started to accrue over those years as Duchess continued to do so. The gap had grown to a full crisis by the late 2000s. Her name was associated with charitable endeavors that raised serious concerns about financial governance and the appropriate financial management. Unpaid fees and complicated financial commitments gave rise to legal issues. Her finances were negatively impacted by the stunning collapse of a large business endeavor. The precise amount of £6 million in debt that was mentioned in a number of reports in the middle of the 2000s is not only a big sum on a balance sheet, but it also marks the conclusion of a decades-long process. Every financial choice builds upon the one before it, every decision exacerbates the previous one. Every rescue that had ended the current crisis did so without ever addressing the underlying assumptions about spending that would eventually lead to the next one. The beginning of each cycle of debt and recovery was marginally worse than the preceding one, with slightly more pressure and fewer options. This is the setting in which she encountered Jeffrey Epstein. He didn't look like a stranger showing from out of nowhere, the way these arrangements looked. The work as someone with ties to Prince Andrew and the financial and social spheres that Sarah continued to have access to because to Andrew's presence in her life. By being helpful to those whose financial circumstances created particular vulnerabilities that he might take advantage of, Epstein had spent years and a great deal of effort creating a network of relationships. His specific type of utility was intended to be exploited. He extended financial support to those in dire need. His counsel sounded sensible and beneficial. Regardless of the person making the offer or their motivations, he provided the particular kind of instant, practical relief that chronic financial distress makes it extremely impossible for anyone to refuse. By the time they started talking seriously, Epstein had already been found guilty of major offenses. His 2008 guilty plea in Florida was well known, extensively covered, and impossible to deny. He was registered as a sexual offender. Public awareness. For months, the public record had established the nature and details of his crimes. She was aware of his identity, she was aware of his actions. When she contacted him for financial support, she was aware of his criminal record and the nature of his offenses. The ensuing private communications made public as part of the 2026 Epstein file releases highlight this point, which makes everything that came after impossible to entirely explain away. Utterly impossible to dispute or lessen, the cash demand was very urgent. Rent is urgently needed, the landlord is threatening the media. There was no denying the precise and forced language of someone who has run out of traditional options and conventional sources of assistance. However, the person she sought out to with such urgency was someone whose criminal record and public persona ought to have made him the last choice. For the private pattern solidified into something that could be seen and documented by the public during the 2010 sting operation. An undercover reporter pretended to be a prosperous businessman who was genuinely eager to make significant financial commitments. The taped conversation revealed an apparent offer to set up access to Prince Andrew himself in exchange for £500,000 in cash. This was not the conversation of someone who had encountered an uncommon circumstance. Not comprehend, but rather the words of someone whose financial desperation had by then been driving desperate decisions for years, and whose unique access, the capacity to open doors due to her royal adjacent status and her ongoing closeness to Andrew, had become the only commercial asset she thought she had that could be turned into quick financial relief. Following the release of the video, she publicly apologized. "It was a terrible mistake made in terrible financial circumstances," she said. She described herself as being in the gutter, a statement that conveyed something deeper and more particular than mere humiliation, and acknowledged that she realized she had struck a real low point. The apology was sincere, and it represented self-awareness that was truly felt. However, self-awareness of the pattern in her financial history has never been enough to bring about the behavioral shift required to eventually stop the recurrence of the same crises. The same cycle was created in different forms between 2010 and 2026. Following the public apologies, business interests, new projects, and increased commercial activity emerged. The commercial activity brought in money from a variety of sources, but it did not produce the structural change that true sustainability would necessitate, a fundamental reconsideration of baseline spending. The spending environment that had been established over decades of living in the royal society remained the standard by which her income was evaluated and consistently determined to be inadequate. Some of the new businesses that were started saw some degree of success, but none of them achieved the kind of long-term financial stability that would have enabled the cycle to eventually break. By 2026, the Epstein Files document releases had changed not just the financial aspect of the narrative, not only the reputational aspect. The private correspondence, which was never meant for public viewing, showed a huge discrepancy, almost a chasm, between what she had said in public about her relationship with Epstein, the cautious distance, the expressions of regret, the explicit declarations that she had broken off contact, and what the documentary record of her private correspondence actually revealed. The intimacy, the warmth, and the long-lasting personal connection that persisted long after any plausible denial of his character could be sustained. In a television interview, her description of him as a supreme friend, her private apologies to him following her own public criticism, and her appeal for his advice should all be addressed. The institutional response was prompt, thorough, and unwavering. 7 non-profits were shut down. Their relationships with her right away. Organizations based solely on public trust, such as Julia's House, the Natasha Allergy Research Foundation, the Teenage Cancer Trust, Prevent Breast Cancer, the British Heart Foundation, and a children's literacy charity, quickly and without much thought determined that continuing to be associated with someone whose private communications so blatantly contradicted her public account of the same relationship was simply unmanageable, untrustworthy, and unacceptable. Her freedom of the city was unanimously revoked by the City of York, and the debate's rhetoric was harsh and straightforward. The council did not want to formally honor someone who had referred to a convicted paedophile as a supreme friend, but they also did not expect perfection from her. When the document releases came, the companies and endeavors connected to her name were already shrinking, but they continued to do so afterward. Early in 2026, she oversaw the dissolution of 6 businesses in a short period of time. A quick breakdown that signified a commercial ecosystem's accelerated demise. The business environment that had supported her for decades following her divorce was no longer producing the same opportunities or operating at the same level. Once a convertible asset in certain international circles where royal proximity had true business worth, the name Ferguson now carried the particular connotations that the document releases had linked to it in ways that the network of affluent friends and golf. She was no longer able to completely offset or manage the relationships and social contacts that had previously supported her formal salary. The Austrian Alps, a £2,000 per night wellness resort where she is allegedly spending against the expectation of a deal that will eventually settle the accumulated debt, the ongoing memoir negotiations, the documentary bidding process, and the ongoing discussions about candid interviews serve as the current culmination of this entire trajectory. Every single possible possibility that is genuine enough at the time to maintain the assurance that it will come to pass, each of which is greatly complicated by the particular circumstances that initially made them necessary. The legislative request for testimony remains unanswered in the American market, where the biggest numbers and rewards are being discussed. Additionally, there are legal dangers associated with explicitly addressing the questions that a significant interview would raise. Full commercial computation. The situation that exists in 2026 is a result of the pattern that started in Westminster Abbey in 1986, the belief that the cost is never a constraint, that the system will absorb it, and that the rescue will materialize from somewhere. This is not because she lacks intelligence, resilience, or the particular kind of warmth and charisma that have always been her most genuine personal qualities, but rather because those qualities were never combined with the specific behavioral change that would have been required to break the pattern before it gained its current momentum and weight. Somewhere the 2010 video is still available. In that private area, the camera captured a handshake, opening doors, and a discussion over £500,000. It was the most noticeable instance of a pattern that, at the time of recording, was already decades old and has persisted in its fundamental form for the past 15 years. The palace doors are now locked in a different manner than they were previously. The bank accounts are being examined in ways that they were not previously. In ways that cannot be undone or altered, the documentary record of what was said in private is now part of the public archive. Whether this specific moment, this confluence of exposure, institutional consequence, and crisis, is the version of the crisis that results in something truly different, a reckoning that modifies the real relationship to spending instead of merely resolving the current instance of overspending, an account of the Epstein. The dilemma that the present moment truly includes is whether a connection is honest enough to be credible rather than managed enough to be financially profitable. Based on the past, the trend indicates that it won't. The pattern implies that the next rescue will take place in some capacity and that the cycle will carry on in its fundamental form for a subsequent iteration. In the past, Sarah Ferguson has taken people by surprise. From seemingly unretrievable positions, she has created second acts. She has discovered the resilience that those who dismissed her did not acknowledge, but the kind of surprise needed at this particular moment differs from the ones she has previously produced. It would necessitate a fundamental change in how one views money, comfort, and the idea that cost is never a limiting factor, which is a whole new kind of surprise. Whether it's the credit cards, the Austrian chalet, or the constantly. The question that can only stay open for the time being is whether the familiar pattern is continuing unaltered or if a woman is actually getting ready for a new chapter in her life. The big glasses, the white cap, and the noticeable red hair all point to a solution that will finally be revealed in the future. The price is being computed. The bill is finally arriving as it always does, and the question of who will pay it this time and whether paying in. The entire 4 decades of this story have been building toward whatever form results in something truly distinct from what all the prior payments achieved.